This video is the product of 4 years of research, production, and investment. It is being given away for free. In the event that this video and/or channel is deleted, please visit Leonard Ulrich BitChute. Like, share, and subscribe. It helps to fight YouTube censorship. Details on DVD copies and donations are available at nwotruth.org. This is not the film I wanted to make. This is the film that had to be made now. I was set to release this film in January 2020, and I'm glad I didn't. It would have been a mistake to release it without this first section, because the greatest economic reset in history is now here. Many portions of this film that I plan to complete may never be finished. I had to spend 3 months getting the answers to 3 questions. What are the true origins of the COVID-19 virus? What blew up the global economy? The virus or something else? How is the virus crisis advancing globalization as described in the Bible? Hi, I'm Leonard Ulrich, and this is a second feature presentation in the New World Order, Secret Societies, and Biblical Prophecy film series called The Illusion of Money. As you might have guessed by the series title, this film is from an informed Christian perspective. Faster than you can click away, you will be getting verified information here that few other sources will give, because they won't acknowledge facts which independently align with biblical truths. Now, where did the COVID-19 virus come from? China has a virus research program which is inseparable from its acknowledged weapons program. In May 2013, a sample of this new virus from this patient arrives in Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg through Ron Fouché of the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam. In March 2019, a shipment of deadly virus ends up in China, sent to it from the Level 4 Biolab in Winnipeg. This causes biowarfare experts around the world to question why Canada was sending lethal viruses to China. In July 2019, Dr. Zhangyao Chu, her biologist husband, and research associates are not only barred from the Winnipeg lab, but are all deported from the country because they are all Chinese nationals.
Just over a week ago, Chu, her husband, and her students from China were evicted from Canada's only Level 4 lab, their security access revoked. Staff at the lab was told last Monday the couple is on leave and not to communicate with them.
Before being deported, Dr. Chu made at least 5 trips to assist biologists in China at the National Biosafety Lab in Wuhan. In February 2020, Dr. Frank Plummer, who headed up the lab in Winnipeg and received the virus from Saudi Arabia, dies a troublesome death in Kenya. On top of all this, China's Thousand Talents Plan is an entire program dedicated to recruiting non-Chinese innovators through funding or to steal Western technology through bribery. The official explanation of the COVID-19 virus through the Chinese Communist Party was that the virus originated from the Wuhan wet market. This explanation quickly fell apart when the medical journal The Lancet noted that members of the initial group of COVID-19 victims did not have contact with this area. Furthermore, patient 0, or the first person to contract COVID-19 in Wuhan, was never identified. In February 2020, the scientific journal Nature published an article entitled "A Pneumonia Outbreak Associated with the New Coronavirus of Probable Bat Origin." This article was a poor attempt to explain away the origins of the COVID-19 virus. Look at the first and last names of the scientific authors of this paper, Peng Zhu and Shi Zhengli. These are the same names that appeared in several scientific journals, such as these two in November 2015 and December 2007. Chinese scientists wanted to know for years how some bats could carry coronaviruses and not experience their symptoms, and whether this type of virus could mutate and be transmitted to humans to avoid another pandemic. In fact, Shi Zhengli gave a presentation in November 2018 called "Studies on Bat Coronaviruses and its Cross-Species Infection." This is confirmed by the paper of December 2007, written by Shi Zhengli, Peng Zhu, and others, which states that these scientists constructed and purified pseudoviruses based on HIV. COVID-19 is a Chinese-engineered pseudovirus that combines a coronavirus modified with HIV. Since it can be spread from human to human through droplets in the air, COVID-19 can be thought of as Chinese-made flying AIDS. The development of COVID-19 in China was ironically assisted with funding from America. An article in the October 2014 edition of The Scientist announced a moratorium on gain-of-function research where pathogens like SARS and MERS are manipulated to alter their capabilities, like giving the virus H5N1 the ability to transmit between ferrets through the air. The moratorium was announced due to a series of biosafety lapses at federal research facilities in the United States. In yet another example of a scientific publication trying to deny reality, a November 2015 article entitled "Lab-Made Coronavirus Triggers Debate" in The Scientist has been updated to prove that there is no evidence that COVID-19 leaked from a lab. The Wuhan Institute of Virology has officially denied that Wan Yongling is patient zero, stating that she has left the team and that she is in good health without providing any evidence for these claims. All her research papers have been removed since 2015, and her bio has been left blank. The Chinese Chernobyl of COVID-19 probably started with Huan Yongling.
But there is a growing belief that the COVID-19 virus originated in the Wuhan lab, not as a bioweapon, but as China's effort to find and deal with viruses to show the world China was as good as or better than the U.S. on that front. It's believed that the virus was bat to human, and then the human, patient zero, worked at the lab, went into the population in Wuhan, and the virus quickly spread from there. China, according to sources, moved quickly to shut down travel domestically from Wuhan to the rest of China, but did not immediately stop international flights from Wuhan. These sources say the World Health Organization was complicit from the beginning, helping China cover its tracks.
China has a bioweapons program in response to America's bioweapons program. A neoconservative or fascist think tank known as the Project for the New American Century wrote a paper in December 2000 called "Rebuilding America's Defenses." This paper stated that advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. This should come as no surprise to students of Bible prophecy. Jesus himself in Matthew 24, verse 7, stated that nation shall rise against nation. The Greek word used for nation in this verse is ethnos. Waging war on an ethnic level through biological weapons is becoming a reality in the 21st century. COVID-19 did not start our current economic collapse. The collapse started in mid-September 2019 in America's repo market, where America's big banks treat the Federal Reserve like a pawn shop. These banks temporarily sell assets to the Federal Reserve for cash, then buy their own assets back from the Fed during the next working day, to at most 30 days later. America's big banks are required to balance their books at the close of every working day, otherwise they would go into infinite amounts of debt. The number of Fortune 500 executives who resigned from their positions by the end of 2019 was very high, peaking to a record number in February 2020 when it became obvious that the Chinese Chernobyl would infect the rest of the world. The stock market also peaked in February 2020 when not even roughly $7 trillion pumped into Wall Street firms to buy back their own shares through the repo market could keep the financial bubble inflated.
The problem is the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates so low for so long to artificially stimulate the economy that it has inflated a gigantic bubble. And the coronavirus may be the pin, but the problem is not the pin, but the bubble that the pin pricks.
Bankers and globalists took advantage of the situation they arranged. They used COVID-19 as the cover for the controlled demolition of the economy, ensuring that the public spotlight wasn't on them. The virus also allowed the Illuminati financiers to profit once again by charging significant interest rate margins and administration fees on trillions of dollars that the Federal Reserve created out of thin air and distributed to the banks virtually for free. The controlled demolition of the economy is also further consolidating wealth. With so much of the world on lockdown, only very large businesses that were deemed to be essential services were allowed to remain open, while millions of small businesses were forced to close and take bankers' loans to survive. Central banks like the Federal Reserve are now buying junk bonds, triggering other banks and hedge funds to do the same thing to make another layer of guaranteed profits. The Federal Reserve is one step away from printing money out of thin air, buying stocks with it, and destroying the purchasing power of what is left of your savings. If you want to know where this is headed, look to Venezuela. Bill Gates was born in Seattle in 1955. Bill's father, William Gates II, was an attorney who was well connected with the elite and who co-founded Preston, Gates & Ellis, a law firm that had offices across the United States and China.
Mr. Gates was born in Bremerton, Washington, and is the third in his family to have the same name, his grandfather being the first, William Henry Gates. He enlisted in the United States Army, changing his name to William Gates Jr. to avoid the appearance of elitism. This according to your Wikipedia biography.
Also true.
William Gates helped to lead the state income tax initiative for Washington state. William Gates, along with Prescott Bush, sat on the board of Planned Parenthood, the largest chain of abortion mills in America. Planned Parenthood was founded by Margaret Sanger, a eugenicist whose staff had ties to the Nazi regime and who wanted to eliminate black people in America. Mary Gates was a school teacher who became chairman of the United Way, having been born into a banking family who had ties to the Federal Reserve System. Later in life, when pressed on whether there was something special, perhaps even divine about the human soul, Bill Gates replied, "I don't have any evidence on that." Bill Gates attended the prestigious Lakeside School, one of the few schools that had a computer room in the late 1960s, where Bill taught himself to code. While still in Lakeside School, Bill and his friend Paul Allen formed a company which got paid big money to write programs and find bugs in software. This is ironic because Bill Gates probably created the first computer virus. Bill and Paul created Microsoft, and the rest is history. Bill Gates didn't even have a product when he licensed DOS to IBM. Paul Allen bought and rebranded QDOS instead. Microsoft stole Windows from Apple. Apple stole its operating system from Xerox.
Let's plug it in. It's going to say, hey, I see you plugged in a new device, and it's going to load in the appropriate drivers. You'll notice that this scanner build, whoa. Moving right along.
That must be why we're not shipping Windows 98 yet.
Absolutely.
Paul Allen has written in his memoirs that Bill tried to cut his share of Microsoft while he was recovering from cancer, and that Bill is a bully. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was created in 2000 when Bill donated most of his shares in Microsoft to the foundation in order to avoid paying taxes. It is now the largest private foundation in the world, currently managing around $50 billion. The foundation has collected billions from the Billionaires Club, whose members openly want a reduced population. The primary activity of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is vaccination. Bill Gates flew on the Lolita Express, Jeffrey Epstein's private jet, and made donations supervised by Jeff Epstein, who was running his own eugenics operations on top of a pedophile operation. An engineer employed by Bill Gates was arrested at the Gates estate for trafficking thousands of inappropriate photos of children. Intellectuals have always wanted to rule the masses. Plato's Republic discussed population control. Aristotle advanced abortion and infanticide. Sir Thomas Malthus wrote his essay on the principles of population in 1798, which advocated for diseases, wars, famines, and genocides as ways to check population growth. Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, created the pseudoscience of eugenics, or the cultivation of race. The word eugenics comes from the Greek word meaning of noble birth. The founder of IBM, Thomas Watson, created a subsidiary business which maximized the labor output of the Nazi concentration camps. Top Nazi officials claimed in the Nuremberg trials that their eugenics program was modified from America's eugenics program. John Opel, CEO of IBM, was also on the board of directors of the United Way, along with chairwoman Mary Gates. Now that you have a basic history of the Gates family and of eugenics, it is no wonder that Bill Gates, who doesn't have any degrees, has become the world's most influential doctor and an open proponent of population control.
So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero, and that's going to be based on the number of people, the services, each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. That's a trade-off society is making because of very, very high medical costs and a lack of willingness to say, is spending $1 million on that last 3 months of life for that patient, would it be better not to lay off those 10 teachers and to make that trade-off in medical costs? But that's called the death panel, and you're not supposed to have that discussion.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds the National Institutes of Health, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the Center for Disease Control. In fact, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the second largest funder of the World Health Organization, or WHO, second only to the United States taxpayer. The leadership of the WHO is corrupt to the core. A team of 6 investigators was overwhelmed with nearly 250 cases of sexual misconduct, bribery, and roughly $200 million spent on lavish travel in 2018 alone. The head of the WHO was Health Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the racist, violent, Marxist party which rules Ethiopia. Given the business ties between Ethiopia and China, and ideological ties between Ghebreyesus and Jinping, it's no wonder that the WHO never criticized China's handling of the coronavirus. Members of the Trump administration's coronavirus response team are pushing the Gates vaccination agenda.
I've heard estimates that you could need hundreds of thousands of people to adequately do contact tracing. Now we're learning that people may spread this even before they have symptoms. In the pre-symptomatic phase, they could be more contagious. Do we have enough infrastructure to contact trace the way that we need to?
I think that's why the criteria that you can see the Gates that the federal government has recommended are fairly strict. I think that's why the criteria that you can see the Gates that the federal government has recommended are fairly strict.
Dr. Anthony Fauci is on the Leadership Council of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Fauci told an audience at Georgetown University in January 2017 that there would be a surprise viral outbreak during the Trump presidency.
Given, as you heard from the introduction, that I have been around for a while and have had the opportunity and the privilege and the pleasure of serving in 5 administrations, I thought I would bring that perspective to the topic today, is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak.
Perhaps Dr. Fauci said this with such confidence because the Wuhan lab, which is the source of the COVID-19 pandemic, was experimenting on bat coronaviruses with funding given to it from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. The director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within the National Institutes of Health was none other than Dr. Fauci.
You will always have conspiracy theories when you have very challenging public health crises. They are nothing but distractions. I can assure you, we have so much to do to protect the health and the welfare of the American people that I would just hope we just put those conspiracy stuff and let somebody write a book about it later on, but not now.
Dr. Deborah Birx is a member of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, a fund known for billions of dollars worth of fraud. The Global Fund was also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Now, malaria is, of course, transmitted by mosquitoes. I brought some here so you could experience this. We'll let those roam around the auditorium a little bit. There. There's no reason only poor people should have the experience.
Dr. Birx worked at the CDC with Dr. Robert Redfield, who is being investigated for research misconduct regarding the development of the AIDS vaccine. It is worth repeating that the CDC is partially funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In October 2019 in New York, just weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded Event 201, a simulation of what must be done when, of all things, a coronavirus outbreak occurs. 65 million people were projected to die during the Event 201 simulation, and a primary concern to the participants was control of disinformation. This is ironic because Event 201 produced fake news segments with mock news sets and actors who discussed how to control information, which quickly became internet and media policy.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
So at the moment, we want the funds, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government kind of supplies some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Event 201 participants included representatives from media corporations, the China CDC, and the World Economic Forum, which produced a website hundreds of layers deep on how to prepare for a pandemic. The website was designed in the shape of a coronavirus. Event 201 participants also received a stuffed mascot in the shape of a coronavirus.
So what do you do when this happens? A loved one, let's say it's your dad, drops into the family group chat with something he thinks is real. It's something about China manufacturing the coronavirus. There's a link to a site you've never heard of with a message calling it scary stuff. So what do you do with this? Do you ignore it? Do you call them out saying how ridiculous you think this is?
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
If you do that to your dad, you've actually shamed him. My name is Claire Wardle and I'm the US Director of First Draft, and we are a non-profit that we help people navigate the challenges of misinformation online. What happens is that your dad doubles down on his view and he dismisses what you're saying. Use language that's empathetic and to say we're all in this together, and rather than you're wrong, I'm right, here are the facts, because that does not work.
So hold back on all that reactive talk. Maybe try something like this. Yeah, these are scary times. We're all a bit afraid, but let's be careful. What you're sharing is inaccurate, and it feeds into that fear we all feel.
Everybody's anxiety is so heightened right now. People are sharing this stuff not for any malicious reasons, but because they're scared too.
And what gives you a high degree of confidence that this originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that.
Sending more context could also be a good move, but don't drown them in evidence. Maybe send an article from a legitimate source quoting credible scientists on why the virus wasn't manufactured. Conspiracies can be just as infectious, just as dangerous as a virus, so you have to guard against them.
It's very easy to just mute your crazy high school friend on Facebook or to leave a WhatsApp group where people are sharing false information. But right now, I actually think there's kind of a responsibility on all of us to help people understand that sharing that kind of information is increasing the level of pollution.
A May 2010 report called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation was named after its founder, John D. Rockefeller. The oil and banking tycoon, a billionaire over 100 years ago, said that competition is a sin. David Rockefeller wrote on page 405 of his book, Memoirs, that some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global, political, and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. Pages 18 and 19 of the May 2010 report, in a section called Lockstep, are extremely interesting. These 2 pages describe a hypothetical future scenario which has become reality to a remarkable degree. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked across the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. The United States' initial policy of strongly discouraging citizens from flying proved deadly in its leniency, accelerating the spread of the virus not just within the US, but across borders. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantines for all citizens saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries. At first, the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms. Biometric IDs for all citizens, for example, and tighter regulation of key industries. Extreme free market economist Milton Friedman stated, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. Private groups or individuals are using money and connections to shape public policy instead of politicians who should be accountable to the public. This is especially true when politicians are steered towards overreaching policies to avoid worst-case scenarios through fear. It is now apparent that the initial estimates of COVID-19 transmission and mortality rates are off between 2 and 3 orders of magnitude to promote fear-based compliance in the public. These estimates were given to politicians and the public by researchers indirectly funded by Bill Gates."
We've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. The intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
The world has been taught to fear COVID-19 more than it should because of the numbers of deaths falsely attributed to the real virus. This is especially true in America, where the combination of federal compensation to hospitals dealing with COVID-19 and the official National Institutes of Health policy have distorted mortality rates from COVID-19 to the point where doctors are speaking out on television.
Well, last Friday, I received a 7-page document that sort of told me that if I had an 86-year-old patient that had pneumonia but was never tested for COVID-19, but sometime after she came down with pneumonia, we learned that she had been exposed to her son, who had no symptoms, but later on was identified with COVID-19, that it would be appropriate to diagnose on the death certificate COVID-19.
Why in the world would they be sending you out information to fill out death certificates, whether the person's been diagnosed with COVID-19 or not, but then to say in the death certificate this person's death was caused by COVID-19? That does not sound right to me. So with that being said, why would they want to skew the number of deaths due to COVID-19?
Well, fear is a great way to control people.
Anytime
healthcare intersects with dollars, it gets awkward. Right now, Medicare has determined that if you have a COVID-19 admission to the hospital, you'll get paid $13,000. If that COVID-19 patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000, 3 times as much. Nobody can tell me after 35 years in the world of medicine that sometimes those kinds of things impact on what we do.
So they've made a line of cars with medical personnel on the cars as opposed to patients.
Correct.
And the viewer does not know that.
Correct.
And these folks here were pretending to treat some of these medical personnel instead of real patients?
Yes.
Just for CBS This Morning?
Yes.
When you tell people that even Dr. Anthony Fauci has recently admitted that COVID-19 has caused no more deaths than a bad flu season, they won't believe it because people have been traumatized over COVID-19 through fear and information control. The bankers and globalists are using COVID-19 and the profits that can be made from it to accomplish a series of goals towards their ultimate aim, which is total control. COVID-19 eliminated protests against globalization, contributed to depopulation, increased dehumanization through social distancing, accelerated the anti-cash movement through perceived contamination, increased dependence on government, and shaped people's paradigms through information control. Because a pandemic accomplishes all of these goals, you can expect this card to be played again and again until the world complies through familiarity and fatigue.
In some senses, transmission has been taken off the streets and pushed back into family units. Now we need to go and look in families to find those people who may be sick and remove them and isolate them in a safe and dignified manner.
We're in a live exercise here to get this right. I was the CI director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
We're mobilizing our military and other forces, but we're mobilizing our military on the basis that we do have a vaccine. You know, it's a massive job to give this vaccine. Our military is now being mobilized, so at the end of the year, we're going to be able to give it to a lot of people very, very rapidly.
The next financial paradigm will be central bank digital currencies. A CBDC isn't money. It's not even a currency. It is a control system of social credits. Prices for things will be determined on an individual basis. Say or do the wrong thing, and the prices that you pay will rise. If you cross the line, you will be instantly banned from many options you take for granted. All other forms of payment will be banned. After all, you could be a terrorist or spreading disease.
It's called social credit. It sounds like that show Black Mirror, but it's actually happening in China. The system's eyes are in big data, artificial intelligence, and roughly 200 million surveillance cameras. When it goes national, social credit scores will be assigned to every one of China's citizens for life. And what's weird is that so many people seem okay with it. You lose points for things like jaywalking, littering, tossing cigarette butts, or spreading rumors. And each night, local TV shows the surveillance highlights of the day. By the end of last year, blacklisted people were blocked from booking 23 million flights and 5 million high-speed train trips. And the list goes on. Being discredited makes it hard to get a job, a loan, a hotel room, or put kids in certain schools. Then there's the public shaming. Photo galleries of blacklisted citizens. There's even an app that shows who around you is in debt.
Hidden in the first round of American stimulus legislation was the proposal for FedCoin. The proposal was pulled from legislation at the last minute because technology and public acceptance weren't quite developed yet. That will change soon with the advent of 5G communications technologies that will monitor the entire planet, which are conveniently being installed without opposition while the world is on lockdown. The two final goals for the bankers and globalists are to make you a slave and to corrupt your body and soul to the point where they are irredeemable by Jesus. A patent application was recently granted to a corporation for a cryptocurrency system. The last sentence, taken directly from the abstract, reads as follows. The cryptocurrency system, communicatively coupled to the device of the user, may verify if the body activity data satisfies one or more conditions sent by the cryptocurrency system and award cryptocurrency to the user whose body activity data is verified. This description is a precise fulfillment of Revelation 18, where all goods are regulated in a Babylonian system of commerce, including the bodies and souls of men. Your body will be forced to perform tasks issued to you by central authorities in order to mine their cryptocurrency, making you a slave. The holder of this cryptocurrency system is Microsoft Technology Licensing, LLC, and the patent number is WO 2020-060606. In other words, the patent number is World Order 2020-666. Your vaccination record, which will be required for you to work, will be recorded on your body with an electronic tattoo, which precisely fulfills the definition of the mark of the beast as defined in Revelation 13. Funding for the development of this tattoo system came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Bible even speaks of the vaccination agenda of the globalists in Revelation 18 verse 23, where the merchants and the great men of the earth use sorcery to deceive the nations. The Greek word used for sorceries in this verse is pharmakia, from which we get the word pharmaceuticals or drugs. As if all this wasn't obvious enough, Microsoft recently hired satanic artist Marina Abramovic to promote a fusion of Microsoft technology and her work. This technology will allow users to escape into a virtual internet world where you are allowed to experience and believe in anything but Jesus.
Okay, Alexa, who is the Lord Jesus Christ?
Jesus Christ is a fictional character.
注意到，在美国也会有一些网友甚至攻击您，说病毒是从您疫苗的这个研制过程中出来的。您在用什么样的心态面对这种声音？
I'd say it's an ironic if you take somebody who's doing their best to get the world ready and, putting, in my case, billions of dollars into these tools for infectious diseases and really trying to solve broadly infectious diseases, including those that can cause pandemics. We've got science on our side. We've got morality on our side. Things won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine that we've gotten out to basically the entire world. We've got science on our side. We've got morality on our side. Eventually, what we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person.
The fact that elitists spend so much time convincing the world to follow their plans while they promote Satanism, attack the Bible, and fulfill Bible prophecy to the letter should tell you a few things. It should tell you that the plans of the elite are deceptive while the Bible is trustworthy. It should tell you that there is no political, economic, social, scientific, or environmental solution to a spiritual problem. It should tell you how unique Jesus is, because he is the only religious character who died for your mistakes, so you don't have to. The best thing you can do with this presentation is accept Jesus' offer of salvation or tell others about it, the details of which are pinned to the top of the comments section below. The presence of Christ in your life, which is cultivated through prayer and reading the Bible, will tell you what to do next. The whole world is infected with the sin virus, and only Christ is the cure. Now, how did we get here? Well, that's also a long story. Let's say that Western civilization was a jet, and we could wind the clock back. On September 10, 2001, one day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced from the Pentagon that $2.3 trillion was unaccounted for in the budget of the Department of Defense.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
One day later, the object that struck the Pentagon coincidentally hit the building's accounting division, making this loss impossible to trace. Secretary Rumsfeld was coincidentally part of a powerful fascist think tank which called for an American hegemony based on a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. This group's membership included the president's brother, and its request was coincidentally made 1 full year before September 11, 2001. If you question the official conspiracy theory of 9/11, you must eventually deal with one of the most powerful motives in history: money. 9/11 was a way for 38 corporations to create hundreds of billions in profit from their foreknowledge of the event. Corporate bets were made against companies that would be negatively affected by 9/11 through put options in the stock market. 9/11 was an insurance fraud that made a net profit of over $3.5 billion for leaseholder Larry Silverstein on buildings that were white elephants. It was also a way to cover up the theft of over $2 billion in gold and silver. 9/11 was a way to manipulate oil prices higher by restricting current and future supply. The 9/11 attacks were used to cover up the clearing of $240 billion worth of bonds designed to fund a covert economic war against the Soviet Union with a focus on its oil and gas. The 10-year bonds were created in September 1991 and were set to mature on September 12, 2001. Most importantly, 9/11 was the event which justified the start of the ongoing war on terror abroad and at home, whose cost to date is over $6 trillion and growing. If you want to know how 9/11 could possibly be an inside job, start with a total of at least $10 trillion. 9/11 is only a microcosm of the financial system that profits from deception, debt, and death. This film, like the previous film in this series, is about 3 big ideas. Most of the evil in this world is highly coordinated and is fulfilling biblical prophecy to the letter. Historical and current events are being influenced by evil to make the appearance of the Antichrist highly probable within a generation. Though the world is not yet in an apocalyptic state, the forces of organized evil affect us all now and must be resisted like never before. This presentation is based on 3 years of research, involving the reading of over 24 printed and electronic books, the listening to of hundreds of podcasts, the watching of hundreds of newscasts, and the reading of hundreds of articles. In spite of the research behind it, this film must be selective. No one film can cover the complete history and mystery of money, but I'm going to try. This film will concentrate on 4 areas of study: history, economics, monetary theory, and Bible prophecy. This film will give you lessons about money you wish you would have been taught growing up. It will show you how money has evolved to fulfill Bible prophecy and how these 2 subjects are combining to affect your present and your future. But first things first. What is money? Money is a medium of exchange. Don't focus on the hundreds of different forms that money has taken over time. Concentrate instead on the functions of money. Money must be portable, durable, and divisible. Money must also be interchangeable, scarce, and a long-term store of value. Real estate is wealth, but it's not money because it's not portable or divisible. Leaves couldn't be money because leaves aren't durable or scarce. Everyone would be picking leaves and spending them instead of creating a real economy by working to earn them. You have been trained to believe the lie that the US $1 bill is money. The lie is reinforced because you can exchange these pieces of paper for what you want on demand. The truth is that any paper or electronic currency in the world today no longer qualifies as money because it isn't a long-term store of value. You're being increasingly robbed, and you don't even know it. The money you've worked for all your life is an illusion which centers around currency manipulation. To understand and conquer this illusion, we need to go all the way back in history. Most history and economics textbooks will incorrectly tell you that the world's economy started with barter. The problem with barter is that it revolves around a double coincidence of wants. If you have some wheat and you need a rake, you have to find someone who not only has a rake to spare, but also wants your wheat. This exchange may even be avoided over arguments about the quality of the rake and the wheat. Barter was never popular. In the economic beginning, there was debt, and debt wasn't good. Debt was and is tolerated by the masses because we are all indebted to our parents, family, society, and to God. For the first 2,500 years of history, people worked to pay off their debts to the ruling classes. Debits and credits were recorded without the use of money or barter at all. Since rulers controlled economies, markets emerged with debits and credits. While debt binds a society, it can also have negative aspects. The words debt and sin have similar meanings. Debt enslaves, so does sin. Debt can be imposed upon you by tyrants, created by bad personal decisions, or both. While the economy inside and between empires revolved around debits and credits first, and barter a distant second, this cashless economic system was vulnerable to hostile takeovers by foreign rulers through war. War was usually about money, and the people of an empire were the money of an empire through slavery. Money also began to increasingly revolve around gold and silver. The first biblical example of currency manipulation in the Kingdom Age offers lessons for us all. Genesis 47 details the economic and human effects of the famine that had a grip on Egypt. Joseph, a believer in God, was second in command of this pagan empire. This was because God gave Joseph the correct interpretation and content of Pharaoh's dream, unlike Pharaoh's pagan sorcerers. The dream focused on 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph ordered the excess corn crops of Egypt to be stored up for the next 7 years to survive the famine that he knew about in advance. He collected vast sums of money that people within and around Egypt were giving him for food as the famine became a progressive reality. But instead of recirculating money back to the people, Joseph stored it up. The end result of this intentional currency failure was progressive slavery for the people and absolute ownership for Pharaoh. Gold and silver were transformed from bartering commodities into currency through coinage. The first coins were issued in Lydia around 600 BC. Kings issued coins of gold and silver to pay for traveling armies. To collect taxes, a king demanded that its subjects, including soldiers, return a percentage of the coins. The only way for a subject to get these coins was by giving provisions to soldiers. A king could create more money by winning a war, confiscating foreign gold and silver, and recasting it into his own coinage. No one can do that with paper or electronic currencies. The words money and debt appeared in history at the same time, since coin money made debt possible and encouraged warfare. Kings have always controlled economies through the quantity and quality of coins, until such abuses end up controlling them. The world's first financial crisis involving coinage began during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Athens lost its access to the gold and silver mines of Sparta, but Athens had to keep paying its soldiers in gold coin to buy local goods and services far from home. A deflation occurred in Athens as it was sending its coinage out of the city to pay the soldiers. Athens then fell into the trap that all kings since then have fallen into. Athens decided to inflate its currency by debasing it. Gold coins were recast with increasing amounts of copper to expand the money supply. The world's first system of deficit spending progressed to the point where people no longer wanted the copper coins. Increasing trading ratios of copper coins to gold and silver coins developed. This was the first time in history where gold and silver had a price. The financial strain of 30 years of warfare made Athens surrender to Sparta. A money-changing class emerged as coin money flowed from kings to merchants. Julius Caesar tried to diminish the power of the merchant money changers by reforming usury and land ownership laws. In 48 BC, thanks to successful military conquests, Julius Caesar minted large supplies of coins for everyone's benefit. The people loved him for the plentiful money supply. Julius Caesar was murdered by senators who were often money-changing merchants. Matthew 21 describes a multi-layered financial pyramid scheme that was active inside the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. First, the livestock approved and sacrificed by the priest class, which had to be purchased by God-fearing Jews to pay for their sins, was typically overpriced. Second, God-fearing Jews had to exchange their pagan Roman coins for sanctified temple coins at outrageous exchange rates. Third, this currency exchange typically used rigged scales. Jesus stepped into this den of thieves and shook things up. The only time Jesus used violence was to stop financial oppression in the very place where there should have been reconciliation. Paper money emerged in China in the 11th century as a way of making large transactions more convenient. Paper money, up until the late 20th century, was always regarded as a substitute for real wealth, which was gold and silver. The idea of paper money was brought to the West by explorers like Marco Polo. The goldsmiths of Europe, who adopted the idea of paper money, noticed that most people kept most of their metal money in the secure goldsmiths' vaults. Only a fraction of what was stored there was in circulation among the people at any time. This meant that the goldsmiths could create more receipts for metal than they actually had in their vaults. In other words, they could print money out of thin air. The goldsmiths of Europe observed something else. When they made money easier to borrow, the amount of money in circulation expanded, causing prices to rise through increased demand. When the goldsmiths made loans harder to get, the amount of money in the economy would decrease and prices would fall. The goldsmiths knew that they could buy things at a low price with other people's money, then lend out more money to cause prices to rise. The goldsmiths would then sell their assets at a higher price. This cycle would be repeated to the advantage of the goldsmiths and at the expense of everyone else. Business cycles rise and fall based on the currency supply, which is manipulated. In England, around 1100 AD, taxes were paid in kind. You wouldn't hand a king coins, but instead you gave him a portion of your crops or goods. Medieval scribes would use notches on sticks of wood, called tallies, to record production and tax payments. These wooden sticks would be cut in half lengthwise. Half of the stick would be given to the king, while the other half would remain with each subject until taxes were paid. The unique wood grain in each half of the tally stick would match and verify the notches on both sides of it. Eventually, tally sticks were issued by the kings of England as currency to raise money in emergencies like war. Tally sticks prove that you don't need coins or paper notes to have currency. Bonds, which are loans to a government that pay interest, emerged during the early 14th century in northern Italy to pay for wars between city-states. Governments love to spend more money than they raise in taxation as a way of getting re-elected. Governments make up the difference by selling bonds, which everyone is encouraged to buy. In 14th century northern Italy, governments used bonds as a way to fund wars through mercenary army forces. Nothing has changed since. If bondholders needed money, they could always sell their bonds to other investors. As such, they were considered liquid assets. As the wars of 14th century northern Italy dragged on, the more bonds the governments involved were forced to issue, making the bonds less valuable to investors. Eventually, Venetian Monte Nuovo bonds were trading at 10% of their face value. Remember that interest is paid on the face value of the bond. If the bond interest rate is 5%, and you could buy bonds at just 10% of their face value, you could earn a handsome return of 50%. For roughly 200 years, the Venetian nobility ruled the world through the burgeoning Italian bond market. Eventually, companies began issuing bonds. Today's global bond market sets the interest rates for the economy as a whole. The bond market is a bubble that's ready to pop. In 15th century Italy, Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici found a way around the Catholic Church's anti-usury laws. This was an important development in this money-lending family. In a 17-year period, 5 Medici were sentenced to death for capital crimes. With Florence being a major port for international trade, the Medicis would charge commissions for currency conversions and for advancing merchants money. Depositors in the Medici Bank would be given discretions. Just don't call it interest. Giovanni Medici diversified, decentralized, and upscaled his investments. He had to, because the Medici were challenged by royalty who had no problem defaulting on their loans since they had armies to back them. Money lending had now evolved into banking. Over 150 years, the Medici family went from backstreet moneylenders to dominating Europe. Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice contains powerful lessons about debt. The point of the play is that all debts are bookkeeping entries using other people's currency and are secured by something valuable. Moneylenders have to be ruthless, or people would default on loans. A key character in the play is Shylock, who became one of the most villainous character types ever, the moneylender. One reason why Shylock was so hated was because he was Jewish. The Catholic Church, which dominated Europe for centuries, forbade the charging of interest on loans. Islam also forbade interest. Jews became nearly the only moneylenders in the Western world because of Deuteronomy 23, which allowed the charging of interest to foreigners only. The result was that Jews were the pariah of Europe, often confined to ghettos in many European cities. A Jewish moneylender would sit behind a table on a bench known as a banca. Now you know the origin of a long association between Jews and finance, and the origin of the word bank. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, was the first enterprise to issue shares of ownership in itself. The company was established by monopoly charter to maximize activities in the growing Asian spice trade. This industry was so lucrative that a single round trip of valuable goods could pay for the ship that was used to transport them. Anyone could buy shares in the company, but if you wanted your money back, you would have to sell your shares to another investor. This created the first stock exchange. The supply and demand of shares between buyers and sellers determined their price. The Dutch East India Company had the ability to wage war against competitors
imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, coin money, and establish colonies, just like certain American corporations do today. Until it fell apart from corruption, this first multinational corporation paid an annual dividend of 18% for nearly 200 years. The total value of shares listed in the world's 58 major stock markets is over $80 trillion. While the price of shares in the Dutch East India Company was based on the balance of supply and demand, the profits generated by this corporation sent prices for some commodities like tulips completely out of balance. As the Dutch corporate elite built estates which featured flower gardens, a demand for tulip bulbs as a status symbol was created. The demand for tulips reached such absurd heights that at one point, 5 acres of land were offered for a single tulip bulb of a particular species. The madness had to stop. In 3 months, the price of tulips collapsed. The point of this story is that the prices of things today are not only determined by supply and demand, but also by greed and fear. The Bank of England was chartered in 1694 because one war after the other bankrupted Britain. Desperate government officials met with money changers to secure the loans necessary to maintain power. The price was high. A government-sanctioned, privately owned central bank was created, which loaned the government the money it needed at interest. While private deposit banks existed throughout Europe before the Bank of England, this was the first time that a privately owned national central bank ever existed. Like any private corporation, the Bank of England was started by selling shares to shareholders who are unknown to this day. While 1.25 million British pounds in gold was supposed to be put up to start the Bank of England, only 750,000 British pounds was ever received. The name Bank of England was deceptively used to make the people think that this private bank was part of the government. The Bank of England building and roughly 1 square mile of financial buildings around it literally became their own autonomous city above the politics of the British Empire. There is London, and then there is the City of London, guarded by dragons. When the Queen of England wants to visit the City of London, she must receive permission from the Lord Mayor of London, because the borrower is servant to the lender. The first manufactured stock market bubble was created by a Scottish gambler, womanizer, and murderer named John Law. Law saw the action of the Dutch East India Company in Amsterdam after escaping from his London prison and knew he had to create a piece of the action. Law believed that money was only a means of exchange, that it did not constitute wealth in itself, and that national wealth depended on trade. Law traveled to Paris, correctly thinking that France would be vulnerable to his ideas about money after debasing its currency to pay for war. Under King Louis XV, Law established the Banque Générale, where 3/4 of its capital consisted of government bills and notes. Law also created what became known as the Mississippi Company, painting Louisiana's swampland as an agricultural paradise. In 1719, Law issued 50,000 shares in the company at 500 livres each, payable with just 75 livres down. The rest was due in 19 monthly payments of 25 livres each. The share price doubled before the second issue of shares was even offered. By the end of the year, prices rose to 15,000 livres per share. Law was appointed Comptroller General in January 1720. In effect, a con man was the Prime Minister of France. All John Law had to do was walk from the office where company shares were issued to the office where French money was printed in the same building. The bubble didn't last long. Food prices in France soared because of the increase in the money supply. People found out the truth about the so-called colonial paradise. In May 1720, Law was forced to deflate the value of banknotes and cut the stock price. People rushed to convert their paper money back into gold and silver coin. Law was forced to close the Banque Generale for 10 days and limit transaction sizes once the bank reopened. Law was dismissed from his position by the end of the year. He spent the rest of his life traveling and gambling, dying a poor man 9 years later. Real wealth is earned from making a living. Speculation doesn't create wealth. Speculation transfers wealth based on greed and fear, and this lesson is never learned. Insurance began in 1744 with 2 Scottish ministers as a way to help out widows and orphans. Insurance premiums were to be invested and claims paid out on profits while leaving the principal untouched. Life insurance helped reduce the financial and social strain of soldiers' deaths in the War of 1812. Eventually, being without insurance was seen as irresponsible. The greater the number of people who are paying into an insurance fund, the more people the fund is able to pay out. This is why, over time, governments who wanted to get re-elected picked up on the idea of covering every citizen from the cradle to the grave. The socialism of overinsurance creates a problem. It reduces productivity through reducing the incentive to work. The American Revolution of 1776 was about money. The founding fathers of America saw how the Bank of England had run up the British national debt, which placed unfair taxes on the American colonies. Before the Revolution, the 13 colonies printed paper currency in addition to gold and silver because there wasn't enough metallic money to keep colonial commerce flowing. The British Parliament passed the Currency Act of 1764, which prohibited colonial officials from issuing their own currency and ordered the colonies to pay all future taxes in gold and silver coins. The colonies were being drained of their metallic money, and any other form of currency was outlawed. The colonies rebelled out of desperation. They printed the continental dollar and grabbed their guns. During the war, the British engaged in counterfeiting as a means of warfare. British agents flooded the colonies with continental dollars, which they printed up. While Britain lost militarily, America lost financially. For a short time, America had to prostitute herself to a private bank called the Bank of North America. While the Bank of England was big, the Rothschilds were far bigger, particularly because they came to own the Bank of England thanks to the greatest financial coup of all time just after Napoleon's defeat. This coup was also detailed in Volume 1, but it wasn't the whole story. The 1905 Jewish Encyclopedia records that the Rothschilds made 5 layers of profit from the safekeeping of the Elector of Hesse's gold. First, on the sale of Wellington's Bank of England bonds. Second, on the sale of gold to Wellington's armies. Third, on the repurchase of gold from Wellington after the war. Fourth, on forwarding the gold to Portugal. And especially fifth, the purchase of Bank of England bonds for pennies on the dollar after the Rothschilds knowingly put out the false rumor that Napoleon won the war. The Rothschilds were so successful because they were above market prices and national laws. If the price of gold was higher in Paris than in London, James Rothschild in Paris would sell his gold, and Nathan in London would buy the gold. The Rothschilds financed Cecil Rhodes' monopoly over the gold fields of South Africa, the De Beers monopoly over the diamond fields of South Africa, the Rockefeller monopoly over oil in America, and J.P. Morgan's monopoly over steel in America. If one nation's policies would hinder their interests, the Rothschild brothers would simply transfer capital and lending to other countries, even to overthrow them. From his base in New York, Jacob Schiff financed the communist overthrow of the Russian Tsar for daring to oppose the Rothschilds. The Rothschild brothers represented the first true multinational banking operation. The Rothschilds grew so rich from money lending that they could afford 41 elaborate castles all over Europe. The 1905 Jewish Encyclopedia records that from 1817 to 1848, the Rothschilds loaned out over $654 million. This staggering amount, adjusted for inflation, is like loaning out trillions of dollars today. The world was entering into the industrial age around the time of the American Civil War. As shown in Volume 1, the Civil War was about breaking up America to place it under banker control. Lincoln's invention of the greenback, or printed currency that would later be backed by gold, kept the Union alive. In spite of their defeat, the bankers didn't stop. The Coinage Act of 1873 deadened the tradition of miners taking their silver from Western America to the United States Mint to be minted into silver coins free of charge. The Specie Payment Resumption Act of 1875 allowed for the convertibility of greenbacks into gold. These two acts contracted the American money supply, creating a long depression. By 1896, the need for more silver money was the key issue in the presidential campaign. William Jennings Bryan spoke the famous line, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." McKinley won the presidency over Bryan because the fix was in. The bankers wanted America on a gold standard, which they controlled. The Industrial Revolution created American robber barons who put up a front of patriotic Christian virtue. J.P. Morgan inherited his wealth from his father, which was based on treasonous business connections with the Rothschilds through George Peabody during the American Civil War. J.P. Morgan, along with his Rothschild agent, August Belmont Jr., continued the family tradition of treason. In 1893, these two men arranged for their vast holdings of American bonds to be sold through third parties exclusively in exchange for gold and not silver. A banking panic over the mass dumping of U.S. treasuries was created. Gold flowed from America to London as London banks demanded gold as security for loans, which became impossible to get. Morgan then patriotically bought $162 million worth of bonds at sweetheart prices with gold at artificially high prices. 15,000 businesses, 74 railroads, and 600 banks went bust. J.P. Morgan bought up everything he could and succeeded in all but crushing the financial role of plentiful American silver through the Gold Standard Act of 1900. This dump and pump strategy would be repeated until J.P. Morgan controlled what became U.S. Steel in 1901 at a value of $1.4 billion. J.D. Rockefeller was one of the children of William Rockefeller Sr. and Eliza Davidson. While Eliza was puritanical, William was a huckster all his life. He sold bottles of crude oil as a cure-all. William abandoned Eliza and his 6 children for a series of women, leaving Eliza to raise her family alone. When J.D. Rockefeller was bad, Eliza would tie him and beat him until he complied. This tragic personal background explains J.D. Rockefeller's desire to manipulate and control all his relationships. He would appear as a Christian philanthropist, all the while being a ruthless businessman. J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil grew from its inception in 1870 through integration and extortion. The railroads which transported Standard Oil had to pay a percentage of the shipping fees his competitors were paying the railroads, or Standard Oil would drop their business. J.D. Rockefeller became America's first billionaire. The banking interests of J.P. Morgan merged with the oil business of J.D. Rockefeller and top railroad company owners to form the Northern Securities Company in 1901. 122 companies agreed to pool their capital at a staggering total value of $22 billion. The Sherman Antitrust Act dissolved the company in 1904, but the capital never disappeared. The business and banking class of America wanted it all. The backstory of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 needs to be discussed at this point. After causing a series of banking panics, especially in 1907, the money changers led the public to believe that the Federal Reserve was a government institution which could control banking in America. Representatives of the Morgan, Rothschild, and Rockefeller interests met on Jekyll Island, Georgia, in November 1910 at a resort owned by J.P. Morgan. Representatives were sent because the real interests could not be seen to be conspiring together. Remember, these were representatives of the money trust whose membership was in competition with each other until they realized it was much better for them to combine forces to control everything. One of these representatives later bragged about their achievement in the Saturday Evening Post, even using the word conspirator. The political point man was Senator Nelson Aldrich, who married into the Rockefeller family. He was successful in passing the Federal Reserve Bill only on his second attempt just before Christmas in 1913. America struggled with the money changers no less than 7 times. First, with England's war on colonial scrip. Second, with the Bank of North America. Third, with the First Bank of the United States. Fourth, with the Second Bank of the United States. Fifth, with Lincoln and the Civil War. Sixth, with the gold standard. And seventh, with the Federal Reserve. The money changers finally accomplished their goal after 128 years. Through their puppet, Woodrow Wilson, the bankers deceived the public into giving them the right to create money out of thin air and loan it to the government at interest. Most people don't have a clue about how money is created. This is because economists and bankers intentionally make banking sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. Though we will use the American example because it is still the largest economy in the world, a similar system is true for 99% of all the nations on Earth. This is how the system works. Politicians get elected by promising people more free stuff than their competition, especially through deficit spending. To pay for your free stuff, the Treasury issues a bond, which is a glorified IOU. These bonds increase national debt and future taxation. The Treasury sells bonds to banks who buy them and profit from them by earning interest. The banks then sell a portion of those bonds at another profit back to the Federal Reserve. The big banks own the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve website says it has shareholders, but will never know who the shareholders are. The Federal Reserve then opens its checkbook based on an account which never had a dollar in it and buys those IOUs with bad checks which the banks honor. When the banks receive those checks, currency springs into existence because about 95% of our base currency is just a supply of numbers. The whole process keeps repeating to produce a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs. The banks are the middlemen in this endless cycle, making a profit several times over per cycle where currency appears like magic. The Treasury then deposits digital dollars into government branches. The government then spends these digital dollars on promises, public works, social programs, and war. The Treasury issues a bond, which is a glorified IOU. These bonds increase national debt and future taxation. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs. Banks are making a profit several times over in this endless cycle where currency appears like magic. When you deposit your pay into a bank, you're not putting it into an account to be held in trust for you. Instead, you're loaning the bank your currency. Within certain limits, banks can do whatever they want with it. This includes gambling in stocks and loaning it out at interest. The banking system doesn't just loan out your currency once. It loans it out an average of 10 times over. This system is known as fractional reserve banking, and it goes all the way back to what we learned about the goldsmiths of Europe. When you deposit $100 into your account, your bank can legally take at least $90 of that deposit and loan it out without telling you. Your bank account still says it has $100 in it because your bank left IOUs, called bank credit, in its place. On page 19 in a publication called I Bet You Thought, published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, we read this. Commercial banks create checkbook money whenever they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. Though central bank currency is different from bank credit, both are considered currency. This means that when the $90 of your currency that your bank loaned out is deposited in another bank, that bank can loan out at least 90% of that deposit, or $81, back out again to yet another bank. This process repeats and repeats so that banks lend out an average of $1,000 for every $100 you deposit. This also means that if banks offer loans at 5% interest, they are collectively making $50 in gross profit for every $100 you deposit every year. Now you know why bank buildings tend to be the largest and most extravagant buildings in every city in the world. Over 90% of our currency supply comes not from each nation's central bank, but from the banking system. Not only do banks create huge profits for themselves from your currency, but also reduce the purchasing power of that currency through inflation. Prices rise like a sponge, soaking up the increased currency in circulation that is chasing a fixed supply of goods. Inflation isn't the rising costs of goods and services. Inflation is currency devaluation through overproduction. Your income taxes on your currency are then paid to the IRS, which turns our numbers over to the Treasury. The Treasury then pays the principal plus the interest on bonds that were purchased from the Federal Reserve with a check from nothing. Politicians then argue pointlessly about debt levels. The financial system is required to create increasing levels of debt, or it will collapse. This is ironic because the financial system will eventually collapse because of debt. If any politician were to be successful in paying off the national debt, there would be no currency left in circulation because all currency is debt-based. Politicians don't want the financial system to collapse on their watch, so they kick the can of fiscal responsibility down the road. Most politicians don't understand the financial system, and those who do either get bought out by it or say nothing because they value their lives. Finally, the secret owners of the Federal Reserve take their cut. Remember, America's largest banks own the Federal Reserve. Not only do those banks make a profit selling our national debt to the Fed, but they also make a profit when the Fed pays them interest on reserves held at the Fed, and the Fed pays them a 6% dividend on their ownership of the Fed. All this stems from the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor a reserve. Inflation is a banking tax, but it's not the only banking tax you pay. The Grace Commission of 1984 under President Reagan made nearly 2,500 recommendations in 47 reports when it came to cutting government waste. From page 12 of the info pack summarizing all the reports, we read three disturbing conclusions about income taxes in America. 1/3 is consumed by government waste, 1/3 escapes collection through the underground economy, and 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt and by transfer payments. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on public services. Three things happened in 1913 that every American needs to know about. The Federal Reserve took over America, the Anti-Defamation League was established, and the 16th Amendment allowing for an unconstitutional tax on America's labor was never ratified. There is no law requiring Americans to pay income tax. All income taxes in America, which go to the banks, are collected voluntarily under the appearance of law.
I really expected that, of course, there's a law that you can point to in the law book, the code that requires you to file a tax return. Of course there is. Maybe I don't know what it is right then as he was speaking to me, but sure. So naively, I agreed to go off and research it and get back to him. 3.5 months later, I was at that point where I couldn't find the statute that clearly made a person liable, at least not me and most people I know, and I had no choice in my mind except to resign.
I had to leave the IRS because I presented evidence that I had accumulated indicating that the agency was violating the law and violating people's rights. And I asked the agency for a response to my sincere concerns. And the answer I got was that they would not respond to my concerns and that they would provide me with the paperwork necessary to tender my resignation.
I thought, let's put this baby to bed. I'm hearing all these rumors. I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'll answer these people's questions that are asking me, and then I'll win this $50,000. And, based on the research that I did throughout the year 2000 and that I'm still doing, I have not found that law.
All taxation is forceful. It's backed up by physical force. If you don't pay your taxes, the government will intervene with you forcefully. So you don't have a choice. It's not voluntary. You can't decide not to pay and not suffer a consequence. If you don't pay, you'll go to jail.
Well,
so you're forced to pay.
You don't go to jail. Some people go to jail. There are all kinds of civil penalties. If you don't pay your taxes, you pay interest and you pay penalties. The fact of the matter is, our system is a voluntary system.
The banking sector is the only group that wins from warfare, no matter what the outcome. Warfare creates instant and massive long-term debt because there is nothing a country won't buy in the interest of national security. When a war is over, huge rebuilding costs are added to the debt, which can also be used to rebuild an enemy's army to repeat the cycle of debt and death. This is why William Jennings Bryan, President Wilson's Secretary of State, resigned from his post in protest over his suspicions of the Lusitania affair. The bankers were far from done transferring more wealth to themselves. It was time for financial war. The bursting of the Wall Street bubble in October 1929 was the result of reversing the decade-long currency and credit increase that created the bubble in the first place. By 1929 in America, 60% of cars and 80% of home radios were bought on credit. Taxes on a person with $1 million annual income dropped from $600,000 to $200,000, while taxes on the middle and lower classes increased. The top 0.1% in 1929 America had an income equal to the bottom 42% of that population. Back then, 80% of Americans had no savings at all. People could buy stocks with just 10% down, and buy they did. $8 billion worth. When Joe Kennedy got an unsolicited stock tip from a shoeshine boy, he knew it was time to get out of the market. Political and economic insiders like Bernard Baruch gave their peers like Winston Churchill advice to get out of the stock market just a few weeks before the crash. The London stock market also crashed 1 month before the Wall Street crash. This was the result of the financial and physical damage done to Britain and Europe from World War I and from Germany's inability to pay the impossible terms of its war debts. The punch bowl of phantom wealth based on credit was removed. Bankers never lose in a stock market crash. Wealth is never destroyed. It is transferred. While bankers have the ability to create credit out of thin air, they can recover their losses by seizing the real assets which secure the loans they make. This is what happened with Executive Order 6102, which required Americans to hand over almost all their gold to the Federal Reserve by the anniversary date of the Illuminati. Insiders like Bernard Baruch and Winston Churchill were aware of these pending developments. They traded their gold through the Federal Reserve for Federal Reserve notes at a profit, like most Americans did, because the Federal Reserve was willing to pay above market prices for gold at the time. But the bankers had the last laugh. As soon as they had the people's gold, they raised the price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce and put $50 worth of currency into circulation for every ounce of gold they had. The Federal Reserve also made it illegal for Americans to own gold because if gold can't be legally owned or redeemed, then it can't constrain the central bank. The Federal Reserve devalued the currency by nearly 60%. This stole wealth from the people, transferring it to the banks, which own the Federal Reserve. The banks got their pound of flesh for creating loans on credit out of thin air, which went bad during the Great Depression. The world went from a gold standard to a gold exchange standard, and insiders like Bernard Baruch pushed America to prepare for a new world war as early as 1933, while the banks were funding the enemy. The Bank of Canada has a history similar to that of the Federal Reserve, except in reverse. Prior to the Bank of Canada, Canadian banks would issue their own banknotes or currency as a way to settle accounts between institutions. The Bank of Montreal, the largest Canadian bank at the time, acted as the nation's banker. The Bank of Canada was established in July 1934 as a private corporation. It was nationalized in 1938 as a Crown corporation. Without Gerald Grattan McGeer, Canada wouldn't have had a nationalized central bank at all. The Bank of Canada financed Canada's involvement in World War II by printing money to pay for it. It also funded the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway without producing inflation because such an expenditure grew the economy through increased efficiency. The Bank of Canada has the right to issue money at low to no interest for the benefit of Canadians. This idea is so simple that a 12-year-old girl can explain it to us.
Until the 1970s, because of the Bank of Canada, Canada's national debt was held at a constant, manageable level, until the government decided to implement what we now have as our modern-day banking system that is robbing the Canadian people. First, the Canadian government borrows money from the private banks. They then lend the debt-based money to Canada with compounded interest. The government then continues to increase taxation of Canadians year after year in order to pay back the interest on the exponentially growing national debt. What results is inflation, less real money for Canadians to spend into our economy, and the real money being used to pad the pockets of the banks. What I have discovered is the banks and the government have colluded to financially enslave the people of Canada. Presently, the banks only have $4 billion on reserve, but they have loaned out over $1.5 trillion. If the Canadian government needs money, they can borrow it directly from the Bank of Canada. Regarding the debt money owed to the private banks, such as the Royal Bank, we would simply have the Bank of Canada print the money owing, hand it over to the private banks, and then clear the debt with the Bank of Canada. And yes, we have the power and lawful right to do so. private banks are just like the money changers in Matthew 21. They are defrauding and robbing the people of Canada, thus their freedom, and they need to be stopped.
This idea is also so concrete that Canadian constitutional lawyer Rocco Galati, on behalf of the Committee for Monetary and Economic Reform, is suing the Canadian government for abdicating its financial responsibilities and for handing power over to international private central banks. This transfer occurred in 1974 when Bilderberg attendee Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister and Trilateral Commission member Gerald Bouy was Governor of the Bank of Canada. It's so sad that Canadians get more excited about hockey than they do over all the federal taxes that goes towards paying the interest on loans to the Canadian government. These loans were made by bankers on credit created out of thin air. Just like the United States, the Bank of Canada issues less than 5% of Canada's money, while over 95% is created as bookkeeping entries by Canadian banks through fractional reserve banking.
When a bank gives you a mortgage, which literally means a death pledge, or a loan, they don't actually give you money. They click a key on a computer and generate the fake money out of thin air. They don't actually have it in their bank vaults. Broadly speaking, all new money comes out of a bank in the form of loans. As loans are debt, then under the present system, all money is debt. Under the present system, all money is debt. Under the present system, all money is debt.
Led by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, socialism emerged in democratic nations as yet another way to transfer more money to the banks under the guise of providing public programs. Keynes was a director of the British Eugenics Society. He was also a member of the Fabian Socialists, a semi-secret society whose logo featured a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Fabian Socialists wanted to accomplish the goals of socialism not through violence and revolution, but through propaganda and legislation, so there would be no resistance to their plans. The word socialism was replaced with glowing terms like welfare and workers' rights. Keynes' main idea was that when a nation was in recession or depression, the government should intervene by relaxing banking regulations and printing currency. The fact that government programs only transfer currency to the banks through increased government debt was conveniently overlooked. A trio of financial institutions emerged around World War II to dominate international finance. The Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to serve as a bank for central banks. While originally designed to handle German reparations for World War I, the BIS board of directors included top Nazi officials between 1933 and 1945 who would deposit money for the Gestapo. The BIS was supposed to be liquidated after 1945 because of this embarrassment, but it never was. The unelected and unaccountable Bank for International Settlements holds secret bi-monthly meetings in the Tower of Basel to determine the economic fate of its member nations. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was established in Washington in 1948 to restore the world's international payment system after World War II. The IMF, now with 188 member nations, acts as a sister organization to the World Bank. The IMF receives membership dues in the form of currency from its member nations and issues special drawing rights, or SDRs, when it feels it is necessary. SDRs are a digital currency created from an index of currencies from member nations. The World Bank was established in Washington in 1944 to reduce poverty. Funding for World Bank loans comes from a small amount of seed money plus the far greater amount of credits and promises from the governments of member nations. The World Bank enters into commercial loan markets and borrows large amounts of currency at very low rates, which governments that are labeled too high of a credit risk can't get. It then offers loans to these nations at a slightly higher, yet still attractive rate, pocketing the difference between the rates. The World Bank typically takes money from economies through taxation to pay for loans that build large government projects, which are often soaked in corruption. If these projects fail, then the World Bank forces public policy changes on debtor nations, like a reduction in the minimum wage or an increase in petroleum or utility prices to recover its investment. In summary, the World Bank promotes profits for the bankers and socialism for the masses. The IMF manages SDR commerce between nations, while the World Bank manages SDR loans to nations. The world switched to a new financial standard during World War II, when America had 2/3 of the world's monetary gold, and Europe was flooded with American dollars. With the exceptions of Pearl Harbor and the Aleutian Islands, America was territorially untouched by both wars. Gold flowed to America as collateral for the dollars that America was loaning Europe. The Bretton Woods Financial Agreement of July 1944, signed by 44 Allied nations, stated that Allied currencies would be valued at fixed rates against the US dollar, and that the US dollar would be valued at $35 per ounce of gold. For a short time, the US dollar became as good as gold. The assassination of President Kennedy had financial implications, but not in the way that many people think. Kennedy's obscure Executive Order 11110 has been mistakenly pointed to as proof that the president was shot on behalf of bankers. Many researchers claim that this EO authorized the issuance of silver certificates, which would deny bankers their usual interest payments on the issuance of currency. When one reads the executive order referred to in EO 11110, the reality is just the opposite. Previously, the president could have issued silver certificates on his own authority. Kennedy's EO delegated that authority to the Secretary of the Treasury, who happened to be from a well-known and powerful banking family at the time. This corrected picture is blurred by the fact that the Treasury did issue United States notes in the same year as EO 11110. The remaining confusion is cleared when one realizes that silver certificates, which Kennedy never issued, are promises to deliver silver, and that United States notes, like Federal Reserve notes, are promises to deliver taxes and inflation. While the reasons for the Kennedy assassination are speculative, the financial effects of this event are clear. Lyndon Johnson stripped silver from coinage, advanced socialism through the Great Society programs, and plunged America into another war. Throughout the 1960s, the United States increased its spending on social programs and war. Many nations, led by France under Charles de Gaulle, realized that America did not have the gold to back up the dollars it was spending, so they started to ask for their gold back. The United States lost 50% of its gold from 1959 to 1971. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon announced that the world's most highly traded currencies were tied to the US dollar, and that the US dollar was tied to nothing.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. The United States has always been and will continue to be a forward-looking and trustworthy trading partner.
The American dollar continued to be used as the world's reserve currency because of the size of the American economy, but something had to be done to restore confidence in this currency. During the OPEC oil crisis of 1973, Henry Kissinger approached King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. In exchange for Saudi Arabia lifting the oil embargo and reinvesting a percentage of its profits back into the United States, America would buy a percentage of its oil from Saudi Arabia and offer it military protection. The deal hinged on Saudi Arabia selling its oil exclusively in US dollars. Saudi Arabia accepted, and the rest of the OPEC nations followed in 1975. The US dollar went from a gold standard to an oil standard in 4 years. For the first time ever, the value of the world's currencies began to float against the US dollar, which would itself change in value. This marks the birth of the foreign exchange market, or Forex, where now around $4 trillion worth of currency gets traded daily. Beginning with America and Britain in 1979, nation after nation buckled under the demands of neoliberalism, which meant cuts to government spending, lower taxes, deregulation of industry, and greatly increased interest rates. Capital flowed into American bonds and other assets to earn great returns on very high interest rates. These rates made loans to third world nations impossible to pay back. Paul Volcker succeeded in doing what he had been sent by the Rockefellers to do: keep the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. America's exports sagged because they were too expensive due to the strengthened US dollar, and the Third World was held in perpetual debt with high interest rates and low demand for its exports into America in a feedback loop. Neoliberalism was really neocolonialism. By 1982, tax relief was provided for speculative forms of real estate investment, and interest rates were lowered. Wall Street won again as money flowed in from around the world to take advantage of the highly valued dollar and speculative gains in real estate and stocks. The price of oil was then driven down, unleashing an additional surge of capital into Wall Street. Banks went directly into real estate lending for the first time. When the jackpot popped, 747 savings and loans banks failed, profits were privatized, CIA drug money was laundered, and over $500 billion in losses were socialized. The stock market crash of October 1987 signaled the end of the artificial advantage that the petrodollar, neocolonialism, and deregulation gave Wall Street. Money, however, never sleeps. It speculated even more wildly, crashing the Japanese stock market in 3 years, sending the nation into a depression which it has never recovered from. The neoliberalism of Friedman and Volcker was advanced by Alan Greenspan. Greenspan was chairman of the Federal Reserve from August 1987 to January 2006. This means that Greenspan presided over the 1987 stock market crash, the 1998 collapse of long-term capital management, the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000, and the development of the mortgage crisis until 2006. Greenspan used each crisis to advance an agenda of market deregulation, risk globalization, and loss socialization. After the 1987 crash, Greenspan pumped huge amounts of Federal Reserve notes into the stock market. This signaled a new idea that many large Wall Street firms were too big to fail. A growing culture of impunity began to develop, along with delusions of grandeur through futures and options.
You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. Do you feel that your ideology pushed you to make decisions that you wish you had not made?
I found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact. But if I may I just finish an answer to the question previously?
You found a flaw in
A
the
flaw-
reality.
flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
Futures contracts allowed farmers to protect themselves by committing merchants to buying a crop at a set price when the seeds are being planted. The farmer gets a price which can't sink, and the merchant gets a ceiling above which the price can't rise. By signing a futures contract, farmers and merchants have hedged their bets. An option is a kind of futures contract. The buyer of an option has the right to say, buy a barrel of oil for $120 in a year's time. If the price of oil rises to $150 per barrel, then the option has made a profit of $30. If the price of oil holds or declines, buyers are under no obligation to carry through the deal. All buyers do is write off the cost of the option itself. You're not really buying or selling anything. You're making a bet on the price of something going up or down. If the bet fails, you can write off the cost of the bet. If your bet wins, you can sell what you bet on. Long-Term Capital Management, or LTCM, was founded in 1994 as a hedge fund. LTCM relied on the mathematics of two Nobel Prize-winning economists to determine the value of derivatives. In the first 3 years of operations, LTCM produced an annualized return of 21%, 43%, and 41%. It's no wonder that Wall Street threw money at LTCM. But there was something that the mathematical model didn't account for: system failure. The 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 1998 Russian financial collapse proved fatal to LTCM. In less than 4 months, the firm lost $4.6 billion and closed. The global financial system came within hours of collapse. Losses were socialized through a Federal Reserve bailout. Never learning from its own mistakes, Wall Street wanted more money to play with. That money would come from your pension funds and savings. Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. Passed in 1933, the act separated investment banking from commercial banking, which was designed to prevent a recurrence of a speculation bubble that caused the 1929 crash to begin with. With this restriction gone, and with Greenspan lowering interest rates in the wake of the LTCM loss, bankers came up with schemes undreamed of. Money piled into tech firms with no viable business plans and dismal profit-to-earning ratios, all because they had cool domain names and were going to be part of the new economy. Firms like WorldCom and Enron made vast amounts of money in the communications and utilities markets with futures and options contracts through criminal market manipulation, massive accounting fraud, and political connections.
We want you guys to get a little creative,
okay,
and come up with a reason to go down. Just call them, hey guys, finish our queue after coming down.
Okay, so we're just coming down for some maintenance, like a forced outage type thing.
Right.
And that's cool.
Hopefully.
We're just making money hand over fist. Leave us alone. Let us make a little bit of money.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, California. I'm bringing all my power out of the state. Today I moved out over 600 megawatts.
I told you they were all crooks. I just didn't know how much.
As far as I'm concerned, nothing happened in Enron that Ken Lay didn't blast.
The stock market crash of fall 2001, caused partially by the effects of 9/11 and mostly by the collapse of firms like Enron, sowed the seeds for the financial crash of fall 2008. In a desperate move to keep the money flowing through Wall Street, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan kept cutting interest rates until they were at historic lows. Cheap money flowed back into Wall Street at record levels, especially to buy a whole new range of investments called derivatives. There is a thin line between options contracts and bets. When you make a bet on a sports game, you've invested in a derivative. No matter what the outcome of the game, your bet never entitles you to any revenue from any ownership of either team or anything associated with either team. The value of your bet is derived from the performance of the underlying assets or teams involved in that game. Now imagine what would happen to the world of sports betting if you could take out insurance against losing bets. Welcome to the world of derivatives. The one thing that prevents bankers from loaning out nearly unlimited amounts of money is risk. There has always been a risk that borrowers will default on their loans, potentially causing losses for the lender. If the risk of default could be separated from an investment, then there's nearly no limit to what might be invested. This is exactly the idea that a team of young financial geniuses came up with by the pool of a five-star resort during a banker's retreat in the mid-1990s. We have only enough time here to describe the most popular types of derivatives. Their definitions are being displayed now if you would like more detail. The key point to remember is that derivatives are pools of leveraged debt which can be repackaged, recombined, and resold many times over, with banking fees to be made every step of the way. The focal point in the derivatives disaster was the completely fraudulent mortgage market. Corrupt mortgage institutions offered unrealistic teaser rates written into contracts that borrowers didn't understand.
When you heard that your employees in these emails, when looking at these deals, said, what a deal, what a piece of when you hear your own employees or read about those in the emails, do you feel anything?
I think that's very unfortunate to have on email.
Are you embarrassed?
And very unfortunate. I don't.
On
again,
emails,
please don't take that.
How about feeling that way?
I think it's very unfortunate for anyone to have said that.
People applying for mortgages were told to lie about their incomes. Ratings agencies gave whatever credit rating on pools of mortgages that banks were willing to pay for.
People lost money in it, but the security itself delivered the specific exposure that the client wanted to have.
You don't believe it's relevant to a customer of yours that you are selling a security to, that you are betting against that same security. You just don't think it's relevant and needs to be disclosed. Is that the bottom line?
Yes, and the people who are selling it in our firm wouldn't even know what the firm's position is.
You are betting against the very product you are selling, and you're just not troubled by it.
I'm sorry, I can't endorse your characterization.
In all this insanity, the debt and risk to the entire financial system itself kept piling up until the house of cards finally collapsed in 2008. All this is your problem. There is now no separation of interests between the controlled central bank of a nation, the large investment banks of that nation, its main stock exchanges, its largest businesses, the government which supports them, and the military power which backs the government. At the top, your government doesn't work for you. It works for this collusion of interests who will threaten government with social anarchy by bringing down their own house unless it gets a steady stream of tax dollars to continue making money from expanding debt.
Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no.
America's Attorney General, Eric Holder, said that prosecuting megabanks presents a risk to the national and global economy.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large.
The rich are now holding more productive assets than ever, while the people are holding more debt than ever, thinking that they're rich.
And I found a job in my hometown of Irvine at JP Morgan Chase. It pays $16.50 an hour. Now this bank teller, her name is Patricia. She has one child who's 6 years old. She claims the one dependent after tax. She has $29,100. She had $2,425 a month. She rents a one-bedroom apartment. She and her daughter sleep together in the same room. In Irvine, California, that average one-bedroom apartment is going to be $1,600.
You can get those jobs at a high school, and she may have my job one day. So
she may, but Mr. Diamond, she doesn't have the ability right now to spend your $31 million.
I'm totally sympathetic.
She's short 567. What would you suggest she do?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Would you recommend that she take out a JP Morgan Chase credit card and run a deficit?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
Would you recommend that she overdraft at your bank and be charged overdraft fees?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
Since the decoupling of the American dollar from gold in 1971, Western economies have shifted from capitalism to crony capitalism to extractionism. Not only are the bankers who have been responsible for creating the current crisis not going to jail, they are assisting governments in making policies which favor them. Governments don't rule the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world. Banks are now so powerful that billions worth of bank debt are transferred to the taxpayers of nations that the bankers think will simply buckle under and pay. No matter what some may call gold, the world has always been on a de facto gold standard. Economist John Exter developed Exter's Pyramid, which shows that the entire economy still rests on gold only because gold has no counterparty risk. A famous banker said it best in 1966. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have to make its holding illegal, as was done in the case of gold. The financial policy of the welfare state requires that there be no way for the owners of wealth to protect themselves. The famous banker who said this was Alan Greenspan. His successor, Ben Bernanke, could never publicly acknowledge that gold and silver were money.
Do you think gold is money?
No.
It's not money. Even if it had been money for 6,000 years, somebody reversed that and eliminated that economic law.
Well, it's an asset. I mean, it's the same. Would you say Treasury bills are money? I don't think they're money either, but they're a financial asset.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
Why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Some people still think it's money.
Gold and silver have always acted as a warning bell against bankers issuing more currency. This is why bankers try so hard to keep the price of precious metals down. It is theoretically true that currency doesn't have to be backed by gold and silver. In reality, it is no smarter to leave the money supply in the hands of politicians than it is in the hands of bankers. The performance of a national currency can be measured by how many units of currency are required to purchase 1 ounce of gold or silver. When people are free to purchase gold or silver, there is an objective international standard over what the value of a currency is and protection against inflation. Fiat money advocates will tell you that gold and silver can be hoarded by the bankers. While this is true, consider this. In my 3 years of research, I have come across only 2 examples of gold and silver failing as a currency. In contrast, I have come across over 2,300 examples of fiat currency failure. For those who are quick to misquote Ezekiel 7:19 as an excuse not to get involved in gold and silver, please keep in mind that this verse applies to the day of the Lord's wrath. Between now and then, there is only one way to protect your labor from the ravages of inflation by the fractional reserve banking system.
We don't have a system that's working. We have one that basically moves cash around, and we can guarantee cash benefits. It's far out and at whatever size you like, but we cannot guarantee their purchasing power. The financing is a secondary issue, and it's the means to create the real wealth, not an end in itself.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
The goal of the Luciferian agenda, well known to occultists for centuries, was to use America to promote a one-world economy and a one-world religion. Sir Francis Bacon realized that America was the new Atlantis in the early 1600s. The twin pillars of Hercules, separated by the Strait of Gibraltar off the Spanish coast, are the basis of the twin columns of the US dollar sign. Remember that it was King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain that financed Columbus's opening up of the New World. The Spanish dollar was also the original standard for American currency. As the American empire grew over time, the American dollar became the world's financial standard, which became separated from anything of value. The illusion of money was kept alive through the petrodollar by those who possessed the key to the manipulation of measure. The American empire then suffered a spectacular self-inflicted attack which led to the intentional and progressive destabilization of global finances and global geopolitics. Only those trained in the Hermetic arts know what 9/11 truly was, an occult sacrifice which was used to usher in a new world order. America's planned destruction and the warfare that will result from it will lead to a new global financial and political order. In the end, people will beg for a global system of electronic credits that have no value as long as it gives them peace and safety. Nations will give up their sovereignty to a supranational government in the name of security. In the end, money is all about control. The highest achievement of the Luciferian agenda is hidden in plain sight on the back of the US $1 bill. The cluster of 13 stars above the so-called eagle form a hexagram. Hexagrams are used in occult practices to conjure spirits. The eagle is really a phoenix, as described in Volume 1, and has points which combine with the top hexagram to form a third hexagram. When combined with the first hexagram, which points to the descrambled letters M-A-S-O-N, or Mason, the final element in the hidden proof is revealed. The back of the US dollar bill is really the geometric representation of the number of the beast, or 666. The back of the US dollar bill, therefore, proclaims the number of the man of sin who will set himself up in the yet-to-be-built third temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, proclaiming himself to be God.
You're a Hungarian Jew who escaped the Holocaust by posing as a Christian.
Right.
And you watched lots of people get shipped off to the death camps.
Right. I was 14 years old.
And I would say that that's when my character was made.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes, yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all.
No feeling of guilt?
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish, and here I am watching these people go. I could just as easily be there. I should be there. None of that.
Well, of course, I could be on the other side, or I could be the one from whom the thing is being taken away. Well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow.
Are you religious?
No.
Do you believe in God?
No.
En wat een van de dingen waar voor mij een luik open ging, dat ik toen eerst niet wist, maar nu wel, dat is bijvoorbeeld geheime diensten. Je denkt dan van geheime diensten zijn in het belang van een land en van een volk, enzovoorts, enzovoort.
Ja, ja.
Maar dan blijken dat eigenlijk wat ze nu noemen criminele organisaties te zijn. Althans, het systeem is zwaar crimineel.
Ja.
Het gaat over het financieren van oorlogen, het creëren van oorlogen, het creëren van eigenlijk heel veel ellende in deze wereld. Dus ook heel veel strijd.
Ja.
En dan denk ik van jeetje, de mensen moesten eens weten hoe de wereld werkelijk in elkaar zit. Voor die diensten is niets te dol.
Nee.
Niets. Maar ook hun hebben weer hun geldstromen. Want als hun dus in de handel van drugs zitten, of in de handel van wapens, of in de handel van, noem het maar op, mensen. Al dat geld moet ergens naartoe. Alles moet gefinancierd worden. Dus de hele wereld is niet de wereld van waar we allemaal van denken dat de wereld is zoals die is.
Nee.
Deze mensen, de meeste daarvan, hadden een Luciferiaans geloof. Hun diende dus iets onstoffelijks. Hun diende wat zij noemden Lucifer. En ik kwam dus ook in die kringen. Ik hechtte weinig of geen geloof aan hun geloof, of ik was er eigenlijk niet eens van overtuigd dat het überhaupt allemaal wel bestond.
Hail, fellowship's eternal flame. Once again, midsummer sets us free.
This here was taken back in 1999. Colin Powell, the back of Donald Rumsfeld's head. And this is Thomas Keane. 2 years later, he would become head of the 9/11 Commission.
Maar er kwam een moment, toen werd ik dus uitgenodigd, daarom vertel ik dit ook, om mee te gaan doen aan offers in het buitenland. Dat was het breekpunt. Kinderen.
The satanic agenda has always centered around offering what Satan could never give. All the way back to the Garden of Eden, Satan appeared to humanity as the phoenix or fiery serpent bird. When God cursed Satan for deceiving humanity, his form was reduced to a snake. For thousands of years, the phoenix has been wanting to assume his original form and to rule the earth as the god of light. The ironic thing is that the phoenix promised humanity what it already had: eternal life, communion with God, and freedom from want. After deceiving humanity, the cursed phoenix only brought humanity death, separation from God, and constant labor to sustain life and avoid discomfort. The constant need for labor slowly created the need for money. We now have come back full circle to the place where we began. Money is really a symbolic token of human life. all the time we spend working for money is really life converted to money. Money is literally the reminder of the fall of man. The classical English word that is used for money, which can be traced back to medieval French and Latin, is coin. The quince, or pear-like fruit found in Crete, was the first symbol of the fruit of original sin, which was later changed to an apple. The etymology of the word quince proves that the word coin is related to the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There is no financial or political solution to a spiritual problem. God did not send us a banker or politician. God sent us a Savior. Your soul is destined to be separated from God when you die because it has been corrupted by evil. That separation from God is worse than you could possibly imagine. All of us have chosen to do wrong things to satisfy our own desires, which is the very definition of evil. The only way you can redeem your soul is to recognize and accept that Jesus paid your sin debt. The exact words you use to acknowledge this debt aren't important. The important thing is to realize that Jesus took the punishment you deserve so you don't have to. This offer is so simple, so priceless, and so gracious that it makes no sense at all why anyone would reject it. There is an increasing chance that you will pay a price for your commitment. Compared to eternity without God, though, this is no price at all. You can have all the education in the world and not see that evil is organized. You can know everything there is to know about conspiracies and not see that there is a war going on for your soul. In the end, only Jesus will destroy the establishment of evil.
What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his very soul when you can't find another one to buy online? And if you're listening, make money you got and it will surely plague you like the devil, devil, devil. If we reap what we sow, are we nothing more than what we owe? Just $1 and a dream, wake up. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. And if y'all hear me, God oh mammon, for the love of money is the root of all evil, evil, evil. Be careful cashing in before the credit crash cashes you out. If we can't save or die, we might as well spend more of our time. The only one who's spending on a Savior. Before you catch it all out, before your soul gets sold out, just breathe, repent, and you shall be redeemed. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. When things get way too real, will we reach out for the guns or will we reach out to God? And if you're with me, saving dollars while we're losing souls on a whole nother level, level. They say time is money and you can get more money to find, but you can't get more time. If we can't save Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Taking control in a world that's cracked while the odds are stacked. We somehow never cease to hesitate to spit our backs when it's survival of the fittest. What's the point in compassion? Why even get a disease when it's a hospital cash? And evolutionize identity, gorilla like propensity, Lord of this extremity. In your name, in your name. Inside is digging a hole in a wall that's far while both sides are by. We somehow never cease to hesitate to fight to stop. It's to progressive liberation through a government sanction. It's to fiscal conservation through some fiat inflation. Transhuman singularity, coercive cryptocurrency. Yeah, break down the tyranny in your name. In your name. What we feel could set us free. We just had moments.